Good afternoon. It's great to be back at Westminster Canterbury again, albeit virtually. I trust that all of you are staying safe and remaining healthy and avoiding COVID-19. My name is Tim O'Rourke. This is the third of a four-part lecture series on the state of American politics. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, something old considered the legacy of Thomas Jefferson and the continuing influence of the Declaration of Independence. Something new looked at a trio of cases now pending before the Supreme Court in which the court considered whether Title VII of the Civil Rights Act applies to gay and transgender employees. Today's title, Something Borrowed, deals with the federal debt. And next week, Something Blue will consider the influence of foul language in the American discourse, and at a larger level, what we can do about the condition of American society to make it better. I would remind you that I presented four overarching questions that guide the inquiry for all of our lectures. The first question is, was America well begun? How did the founders' values continue to shape contemporary life? Second, what is the link or the tension between fair process and just outcomes in a democratic society? Third, in the absence of an existential crisis, can democracy address and solve big problems? And fourth, can we find common ground through meaningful civil conversations? The questions, in a sense, transcend each of the lectures, but they also correspond in order, the focus of each of the four lectures. And so today's question is, in the absence of an existential crisis, can democracy address and solve big problems? Well, of course, now we have an existential crisis, and the government is all about the task of solving that existential crisis created by the pandemic. But when I put this series together last fall, I saw the debt issue as a looming crisis. And when the government and American society and each of us has gotten through the pandemic and returned to normal life, the debt crisis will remain. And in fact, as I'll show you today, it will be significantly larger than when I put this series together last fall. So today's focus is on Something Borrowed, and it's a look at the federal debt conundrum. And I put state in parentheses because it would be as the result of the significant underfunding of state pensions. And it was estimated coming into the fiscal year that states had an underfunded liability of something on the order of $1.3 trillion. Obviously, the fiscal. I want to present the budget in a sense the way I would have presented it were we not in the midst of this global crisis, and then show how the pandemic has exacerbated this situation and challenged all of us to deal with the global coronavirus. As I report today and speak to you, we've now suffered nearly 50,000 deaths from the virus in the United States. 26.5 million people, roughly 16% of the labor force, are now unemployed. And since the 2008-2009 recession, about 22 million jobs were created. Well, those jobs have now disappeared. They've been erased by the unemployment that's flowed in the wake of the coronavirus. The federal government is in the process of sending roughly $2.7 trillion to the states, to hospitals, to private businesses, and the hope is that the bailout will ease the shutdown in the economy and facilitate a return to normalcy. But the pathway is, at this point, in terms of timetable, very much uncertain. Before launching into the specifics of the debt crisis and the coronavirus crisis, thought it useful to connect to some earlier themes. And you'll recall last week in the discussion of the work of the Supreme Court and the cases that now rest before us, I had occasion to refer to Alexander Hamilton and his writing in the Federalist Papers. It occurred to me that Hamilton was also involved in an earlier question about federal debt, and Hamilton served as Secretary of the Treasury in the first Washington administration. Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, but one of Hamilton's initiatives was to have the federal government assume the state debts that had carried over from the Revolutionary War. And it was Hamilton's belief that if the federal government took over state debts, what was then called assumption, that this would help to reassure creditors, but also bring the states together and create a firm foundation for a true United States of America. There was resistance in many of the states, including Virginia, which resisted being brought in to help retire the debts of other states. And finally, this issue was resolved by a great compromise that involved Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, who served in the first Congress. And the compromise was support for assumption, that is the federal takeover of state debts, in return for the placement of the state capital in a southern location. And so there's Alexander Hamilton on the right, a map of the District of Columbia on the left, and thus the Assumption Compromise. I might note, and this is fascinating to me, that in the Broadway play musical Hamilton, there is a song, Cabinet Battle Number 1, which is about the Assumption debate and the creation of the first national bank. Then too, thinking about previous subject matter, recall that Thomas Jefferson, as president, secured the purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803. Interesting that Jefferson, who was a proponent of strict construction and also a very small federal government, had to borrow the money to buy Louisiana. And in that case, Louisiana cost $15 million, which was borrowed from two British banks at 6% over 20 years for a total cost of $23.5 million, 4 cents an acre, according to historian John Kukla. So a nice illustration of early borrowing and a lesson that borrowing can be good. Was also reminded, because I read a book recently that featured a chapter on William Jennings Bryan. Bryan is credited with giving one of the great speeches in American history at the Democratic Convention of 1896, the famous Cross of Gold speech, which concludes with the line, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And Bryan was an advocate for the incorporating of silver into the national economy. At this point in time, 1896, pardon me, the federal government had essentially moved to a gold standard, and Bryan called for greater reliance on silver, which would have had the effect of devaluating the dollar, but also helping urban workers and rural farmers. And these are issues, of course, that continue to affect American politics. And William Jennings Bryan was, of course, a populist, and we've now seen populists from the right, Donald Trump, and the left, Bernie Sanders. And so nothing new under the sun. And of course, the country relaxed its commitment to the gold standard during the Great Depression and ultimately abandoned it during the presidency of Richard Nixon in the 1970s. Now, in thinking about historical events, I jumped from 1896 to December 2010. And some of you will remember this, but I included this in my presentation because, frankly, this seemed almost as distant a memory as William Jennings Bryan. During the Obama administration, President Obama appointed the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, which published a report called The Moment of Truth. And the report brought together, the commission brought together bipartisan membership, 18 people, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, to consider the problem of the federal debt. And the report says, we come from different backgrounds and belong to different parties, but we share a common belief that America's long-term fiscal gap is unsustainable, and if left unchecked, we'll see our children and grandchildren living in a poorer, weaker nation. The report goes on to say, if the United States does not put its fiscal house in order, the reckoning will be sure and the devastation severe. Since the last time our budget was balanced in 2001, the report goes on, the federal debt has increased dramatically, rising from 33% of gross domestic product, GDP, to 62% of GDP in 2010, driven in large part by 2 wars and a slew of fiscally irresponsible policies, along with a deep economic downturn. We have arrived at the moment of truth, and neither party is without blame. And the commission went on to offer a series of proposals that would have raised revenues at the federal level by broadening the tax base, that would have cut discretionary spending, reform Social Security and Medicare in order, quote, to reduce the debt to 60% of GDP by 2023. I note now that the debt in 2019, before the coronavirus crisis, that the debt was 79% of GDP, a topic to which I'll return shortly. And I mentioned the moment of truth because at that point in time, December 2010, it seemed as if the government was focused on the debt crisis and indeed took a series of measures that would have reduced the debt modestly between 2010 and 2020, but those efforts were kind of lost to time. And in fact, the commission's recommendations themselves did not achieve the requisite support among the commission and were never forwarded to the Congress officially. And as I said, it just seems like the moment of truth came and went and was lost to history. So here now is a chart that shows the debt held by the public as a percentage of gross domestic product. And I might note that debt held by the public refers essentially to that portion of the debt that is held in the form of publicly offered securities and bonds. And the government itself owns some of these, but most, and I'll come back to this, are then held by individuals and governments and businesses literally around the world. The debt held by the public can be distinguished from what is sometimes called gross debt. And gross debt includes the money that the government owes itself. So for example, in the case of Social Security and Medicare, over the years, the taxes paid to support those programs have exceeded the amount paid out under those programs, and presumably those monies have gone into a trust fund. The trust fund is largely fictitious because the government has spent those monies, but in essence, the trust fund consists of money that the government owes itself. And when you see the typical figure on television or in the newspaper about the federal debt, it refers to the gross debt, and I'll show you how that works later on. But debt held by the public, you can see, has varied over time and was very high at the beginning owing to the Revolutionary War debt, surged during the Civil War, and then declined in the late 1800s, rose again during World War II, and then surged during the Great Depression and World War II, at which point the debt held by the public was 106% of gross domestic product. By 2001, owing to growth in the economy primarily and some government cuts in expenditures, especially cuts in defense expenditures, the percent of the debt held by the public in relation to GDP had declined to 32%. As of 2019, it was up to 79%. And before the coronavirus, the Congressional Budget Office had predicted that if we did nothing else, we did not make fundamental changes in the practices of the federal government, that by 2049, the debt would be 144% of gross domestic product. The next chart shows how federal spending and revenues have grown from 1940 to 2020 in constant 2012 dollars. And unsurprisingly, you can see that the size of government at the federal level has expanded radically. But what you also notice is that in the 21st century, there's a sizable and growing gap between outlays and receipts, and that's the debt crisis. Next slide, please. The significant change in the composition of the federal budget is shown in this slide, which is headed Federal Budget Selected Components by Percentage 1940 to 2020. Can we see that slide, please, Bob? It should be federal budget selected components. Good. So the reason I think this slide is important is that you can see beginning in 1940 that national defense dominates the budget. The defense budget declined dramatically in the late 1940s with the conclusion of World War II, but then rose again in the 1950s with the Korean War and the Cold War. And then in the 1960s, you see that the defense budget as a percentage of the total federal budget declines rather dramatically, while the portion of the budget devoted to human resources rises significantly. And the change in the budget in human resources reflects the beginning in the 1960s of Medicare and Medicaid, and also the growth of Social Security. And so the presentation of the budget to modernize now looks significantly different than it appeared back in the 50s, early 60s. And I'll have more to say about this. Here's a portrait of the federal budget 2019, obviously ahead of the coronavirus pandemic. But in fiscal year 2019, the federal government had outlays of about $4.4 trillion against revenues of $3.5 trillion. And so there was a deficit of $1 trillion. And interestingly, when the National Commission to which I referred was meeting in 2010, it was the existence of the $1 trillion budget deficit that helped generate concern about the debt crisis. And here we are again in 2019, after some years of robust growth in the economy and the deficit back at $1 trillion. Now, just to be clear, the deficit reflects the shortfall on an annual basis of revenues in support of outlays. The debt is the accumulated deficits over all of the years that the federal government has run a budget shortfall. So a $1 trillion deficit in 2019. The next slide, the federal budget in 2019, shows where the money goes. And if you begin at the top right quadrant, Social Security, $1 trillion, 23% of the budget, Medicare, $644 billion, 15%, Medicaid, $409 billion, 9% of the budget, and then other so-called mandatory expenditures, $642 billion. So if you start at the top right corner with Social Security and take a circular route down to other mandatory expenditures, it is the case that 61% of the federal budget consists of so-called mandatory expenditures. They are called mandatory because the federal government, through the Congress, has made commitments to pay to Social Security beneficiaries, to Medicare and Medicaid recipients on the basis of prescribed formula amounts. And these amounts are literally not, in a fundamental sense, mandatory because Congress could change them, but they are treated essentially as fundamentally off limits. The discretionary budget is the subject of extensive debate every year, and it's really composed of three elements, really two elements. The defense budget, $676 billion, 15% in 2019. Non-defense discretionary expenditures, $661 billion, 15%. And then net interest, which is really not discretionary because the government is obliged to pay interest on the money that it has borrowed. And so, in essence, 30% of the budget is discretionary, split between defense and other discretionary items. And the rest, roughly 39%, actually it's close to 70%, I should say, of the budget is considered mandatory. And so significant budgetary reform could not be achieved unless Congress would take a hard look not only at the discretionary elements in the budget, but these items now considered part of the mandatory budget. Brief note to look at where the money comes from. Individual income taxes make up about half of the budget. Payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare, about 6% of the budget, and you can see about 40% in that graph. And then the other comes from corporate income taxes and selected other budget taxes, I should say. Tax revenues in 2019 were uncommonly low. They typically run at the level of 18 or 19%. And so a good portion of the deficit in 2019 was attributable to lower revenues, partly as a result of the tax cuts that were enacted under the Trump administration. So we're now in the middle of a calamitous budget year brought on by the government's response to the coronavirus. And that response, as we'll see, has already involved about $2.7 trillion in new federal spending. And so the total federal budget, which last year was less than $5 trillion, will now rise to at least $6 trillion. The deficit is projected to be at least $3 trillion, but it could be as high as $4 trillion. And most of you are familiar with the fact that Congress has now passed a series of bills to infuse the economy with $2.7 trillion in support for businesses, for individuals, for institutions. And that's part of the deficit conundrum now. But the other part of it is because much of the economy is on lockdown, the government can expect far less in the way of tax revenues. This graph, federal deficits or surpluses, shows what the budget deficit situation looked like as of last year. And since the 1970s, the government has regularly run deficits of varying size, with the exception of the late 1990s and early 2000s, when Congress and President Clinton brought about a short period of surpluses, but the period of surplusage was short-lived, and since that time, the government has been running significant deficits, and those deficits, which were about $1 trillion last year, as I said, are going to be significantly higher now going forward. The federal debt held by the public, 1970 to 2019, shows in this graph. As I mentioned, that number in 2019 was about 79% of GDP. In dollar amount, the gross debt, as opposed to the debt held by the public, was about $22 trillion. And the GDP at the end of 2019 was about $22 trillion. And here's the debt held by the public, 2019, $17 trillion. And you see the difference in the number between publicly held debt and gross debt. This next chart, debt of selected countries at the end of calendar year 2018, looks at debt in the United States versus other countries. You can see that some countries, Canada and Germany most prominently, are low debt countries. France, Spain, United Kingdom, and the United States are essentially, or at least were in 2018, in the same ballpark. And Italy and Japan, relatively high debt countries. And Japan has been running a significant public debt for some time. And the next slide shows who holds our debt, and the composition of that debt. So looking at I'm looking at the chart in the upper left-hand corner. In 2009, about 53% of the publicly held debt was domestically held, 47% in foreign hands. By 2019, the domestic share had risen to 59%, the foreign share had declined. However, the actual amount of debt held by foreign governments and private individuals had actually increased. The chart on the right looks at who holds the debt, and I'll focus on 2019, 13% of the debt held by the Federal Reserve, 12% by mutual funds, that is, of the domestic debt. The foreign debt, Japan and China were the leading holders of the foreign debt, and together they outstripped the next 8 largest debt holders. And I'll come back to the role of foreign investors in American debt shortly. This chart looks at gross debt in different years. And so the first year, the end of the Clinton administration, the debt was $5.7 trillion. In 2008, at the end of President Bush's administration, the debt was almost double, $9.7 trillion. The end of the Obama administration, $18.6 trillion. And so it doubled in the Obama administration after having doubled during the Bush administration. And now we are not quite through 4 years of the Trump administration, and the debt has increased to roughly, this is an estimate of $24.6 trillion. Well, what do we make of this? Keep in mind that I saw a major debt problem back in November when I was working on this series, and now here we are with a kind of crisis on top of a crisis. So let me talk about the problems that existed in federal debt last fall, and then add the additional dimension of the coronavirus challenge. This chart looks at debt, it looks at outlays and revenues in relation to percentage of gross domestic product, and is based on the Congressional Budget Office's analysis as of last June. And basically what they saw was in 2019, if you look at the dotted line in the middle of the chart, there the United States government deficit stood at roughly $1 trillion. And unless the government took proactive steps, outlays would continue to grow, revenues would flatten out, and therefore the deficit every year would grow and the debt would grow significantly larger. And so the CBO was concerned about steps that might be taken to narrow the gap between those two lines. Now, why was the gap growing? The next chart shows the annual budget deficit as a percentage of gross domestic product. And you can see this, in essence, provides a bit of detail in terms of the scope of the budget deficit over time. It was 4.2% of GDP in 2019, and CBO predicted if nothing were done, it would rise to 8.7% by 2049. One source of the growing budget deficit, and therefore the growing budget debt, is the changing composition of the population. A higher percentage of the people are age 65 and older by 2049, and these folks, of whom I'm one, would be consumers of Social Security and Medicare. And so the growth of this population accounts for a major portion of the budget gap that we see. Keep in mind the high proportion of the budget in 2019 that was already accounted for by spending for Social Security and Medicare. Interesting element of the Social Security system is that when it was set up originally, there was a high ratio of workers to beneficiaries. And in 1945, there were about 42 workers for every Social Security beneficiary. Keep in mind, in 1945, the Social Security system had only been in place for a decade. In 1950, that was down to about 17 workers. And by the current time, 2015, there were about 2.8 workers for every Social Security beneficiary. And so that declining ratio has a significant impact on the cost of the system. In essence, in a better world, you would have more workers in relation to beneficiaries. This next chart shows the impact of Social Security and healthcare on the growth of the budget. And you see Social Security in the far left, percentage of GDP in 2019, 4.9%, rising to 6.2%, 2049. Major health care programs, which would include both Medicare and Medicaid, 5.9% in 2019, rising to 10.7% in 2049. And then on the far right, the impact of both. And so the combination of an aging population and the increasing cost of healthcare and the increasing coverage of federal health care programs, not only through Medicaid and Medicare, but the Affordable Care Act, means that these programs will have a significant budget impact by 2049. Again, this is all pre-COVID-19. Beyond what you can see, Social Security faces a significant unfunded future liability that's estimated to be $20 trillion. Medicare's unfunded liability is fixed at about $32 trillion. In other words, if we look at the taxes that are levied to support Social Security and Medicare, and look at the growth of the Social Security and Medicare population over time, the taxes over the next 75 years are insufficient to fund the obligations that the government has set out. The Medicare Trust Fund is for Part A hospitals. It's slated to run out of money in 2026. The Social Security Trust Fund is expected to run out of money in 2035. Now, lest I alarm anybody, what this means is that the money coming in to Medicare and Social Security will be less than the money going out even after each of these funds has drawn down on the trust funds that have accumulated over time. And so these Medicare and Social Security will not go broke, but it does mean Congress and the President will have to fix these programs in order to maintain the current level of payout that the systems now require. And this means, of course, raise taxes, borrow more money, or somehow restrict benefits, which might include, as is already happening, extending the expected retirement date for Social Security, which used to be 65 and is now rising to 67. Federal tax revenues are expected to grow through 2049. This chart shows relatively dramatic growth in federal tax revenues. However, if you read closely, you'll see on the far right that part of the reason tax revenues grow is because major provisions of the 2017 Tax Act expire. Major question facing the Congress in the next few years is whether those provisions will be allowed to expire or they'll be continued. If they're continued, the revenue gap or the annual deficits and the debt will be a greater problem. Interestingly, President Trump's 2021 budget proposal, which came out before COVID-19, suggested that the policies endorsed by the budget proposal would bring about a significant reduction in publicly held debt. And so if you look at the dotted line in the upper part of this graph, you see that that's where debt as a percentage of GDP would have been with the continuation of current policies. And then the hard line would be the debt that would result from policies that were endorsed by the president's 2021 budget proposal. And what is suggested here is that the president's proposal carried out over many years would bring about a significant reduction in debt as a percentage of GDP. Without criticizing the president's proposal, I think it's fair to say, in view of what's happened with the global pandemic, that this graph is inoperative. So what do we make of all of this? And I've tried to distill a significant amount or volume of economic commentary into several possibilities that I can understand and that I can present to you. Last year, Jason Furman, who was former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, and Larry Summers, who was a former Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, they're both now Harvard professors, wrote an article for Foreign Affairs called "Who's Afraid of Budget Deficits?" And what they did is make an argument that because interest rates on federal bonds, Treasury notes, are low, that this is a good time for the federal government to borrow money for the right purpose. And so they argue that deficits in themselves are not harmful, especially if money is borrowed for good reasons. And they also called then for more borrowing, but also more taxation. And they noted that the United States had the 5th lowest revenue to GDP ratio among 35 developed nations. And so this article, which is available on the web, called for higher taxes and targeted spending on infrastructure and the safety net, and less focus on the annual deficit per se and the amount of the federal debt, written in 2019. A second approach to the budget deficit comes from what is now called modern monetary theory. And this is most closely associated with a Stony Brook University economics professor, Stephanie Kelton, who's also served as an advisor to the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. And Professor Kelton has argued that the principal factor that limits government spending is not the size of the debt, but the level of inflation. And as you know, inflation is, at this point in time, relatively modest, almost negligible. And for Professor Kelton, the interest rate is the key component of inflation, and she argues that the Federal Reserve Board can control the interest rate, and of course in recent weeks has driven the interest rate down to almost zero, and that the federal government also can influence the interest rate by printing money. And essentially this is argument for more government spending. And if you think about Senator Sanders' campaign, he made a case for retiring student debt, for national health insurance plan, among other major initiatives. And so modern monetary theory is consonant with the ambitions of the Sanders campaign. So others look at both the Summers view and the Kelton view and say, wait a minute, debt still matters a lot. One of those experts is Neil Ferguson, who's a economic historian of some repute, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And he takes up this issue in the Great Degeneration. And this book came out in 2013, but he seems to anticipate problems that we now face. And basically what he observes is that debt in relation to GDP does not become a problem until debt reaches the level of 90% of gross domestic product. And we're certainly approaching that level now. And essentially what he says is that governments borrow a lot of money and then nothing seems to happen. And that's been true in the United States. Governments have borrowed a lot of money, have high annual deficits, a high debt, and yet inflation remains low. And what's supposed to happen under kind of traditional economic theory is if the government borrows a lot of money, it will crowd out private borrowing. It will drive up demand, and inflation will become highly problematic. Since that hasn't happened, then people look at the situation and say, well, we can borrow some more money. And in essence, is the argument that Furman and Summers make. But what the Ferguson contends is that you don't see a real problem until the debt reaches 90% of GDP. And by then it's too late because you've gotten in the habit of borrowing money, and it may be difficult then to break that habit. And he argues that low interest rates are deceptive because high debts impose a limit or a burden, as he puts it, on the growth of the economy. And so some people are suggesting that debt and deficits don't matter, and especially now in the midst of the pandemic, when the government has taken what is clearly defensible action to address this cataclysmic intervention into our economy. And so already the government has spent roughly is spending roughly $2.7 trillion in not only spending, but loan guarantees through the CARES Act, which stands for Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security. And this graph shows different components of the CARES Act: Paycheck Protection Program, where people are paid for time that they'll be displaced by the lockdown, enhanced unemployment insurance, aid to state and local governments and tribal governments, to health and hospitals. And this CARES Act set out about $2.2 trillion, and just today, the president will be signing additional relief that amounts to about $500 billion, or $500 billion in additional relief. And all of this to account for the impact of the coronavirus, which has shut down much of the economy across the country. Let me remind you then that spending this year will rise to about $6 trillion or more. The deficit could be $3 or $4 trillion. Don't know, because the deficit is partly dependent on the growth in spending, but also the decline in tax revenues, because the economy is essentially closing down for 2 or 3 months out of the year. And you probably know, if you follow the news, that Congress is likely to consider at least legislation to help the states address their considerable shortfall, because state tax revenues are suffering a serious hit as a result of the shutdown in the economy. So earlier I showed you this graph, the annual budget deficit as a percentage of gross domestic product. When the CBO did its 2019 analysis, it said if we don't do anything, the annual deficit could rise to 8.7% in 2049. My calculation is that already the deficit is at 14% of gross domestic product and rising. To put perhaps an encouraging spin on the situation, I point to a recent article by Reuben Brenner, headlined "No Debt Catastrophe Yet," and here's what he writes. Whereas the federal debt has more than doubled in the last 10 years, the interest on the debt as of March 2020 is still roughly 1% on the 30-year Treasury and 0.3% on the 10-year Treasury. The reason the United States finds itself in such a favorable situation, which allows it to borrow at such low rates, is the fact that there are no other places in the world for savers to park their money. In other words, we can borrow a lot of money at almost zero interest. And because we can afford to confront the coronavirus crisis with an expectation that this is manageable. Question I would ask, though, is are we ready for the next crisis? Because after, and we will get through the coronavirus crisis, we will still face the overhang of this considerable federal and more substantial state level debt. And then the question is whether, in the absence of an existential crisis, the Congress, the states will be able to deal with this lingering problem of high debt load at both the federal and the state level. And, you know, I've been collecting articles in recent days that look beyond the current crisis to suggest that we got to get ready for the next round of debt crisis that preceded coronavirus and will remain and be enlarged after we get through the pandemic challenge. And so there was an article recently in the Wall Street Journal, the high cost of low interest rates. In today's Wall Street Journal, get ready for the return of inflation. An article, Debt Will Define Our Next Crisis by David P. Goldman. And then an article in National Review, our national debt problem isn't going away. And so we've got, when we're through the coronavirus pandemic, we'll still have the problem, the crisis really, that I thought we were going to talk about back in November. And so this is where we stand. We can borrow money at a low rate right now, which is encouraging in light of the major challenge we have in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. But when we get through that crisis, we'll have some more work to do, and it will not be work that can be accomplished in 2 or 3 weeks of emergency meetings of the Congress. It will be slow, steady, persistent, demanding work over many weeks, months, and years to drive down the deficit, to reform Social Security and Medicare, and put the federal fiscal house in order. I look forward to seeing you next week when we conclude this series, and I'll talk about a kind of books that imagine a new and more compelling vision for America. And I hope to hear from you. I miss seeing you in person and taking your questions. And if you look at the bottom of the last slide, you'll see my unusual email, which is my home email, poli-sci-prof, political science professor abbreviated. So poli-sci-prof@cox.net. Take a look at that. And if you have questions about this or my previous presentation, please get in touch with me. I look forward to hearing from you. And again, it's great to be with you. And I look forward to the day when we can be back together in person. Take care, stay safe, and be healthy.